let's talk about divorce. I know that's a hot-button issue within the church. In fact, there are some within the larger church community who I refer to as the marriage continuist crowd, who think of divorce as being on par with, tantamount to, the unforgivable sin, which it's not. They argue that you must remain in a marriage, only one marriage, that has to last your whole life, no matter what happens, no matter what circumstances you encounter within that marriage. And they base their argument on Malachi 2:16, in which God does say, I hate divorce. And I agree. That is exactly what it says. But, as always, there is a larger context to that statement. And that larger context is the whole rest of the Bible. And when you read the rest of the Bible, what you see is that God, who hates divorce, also divorces Israel. We're going to look at that in just a moment. So what are we going to say about a God who declares that he hates divorce and yet also engages in it? Well, it's that he sometimes recognizes that divorce is completely appropriate and kind of unavoidable. It's very much like when God says, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. And yet the wicked do die, and the wicked are judged, and the wicked are cast eternally from his presence. He takes no pleasure in it. It doesn't bring him joy or happiness, and yet it is completely appropriate, given the circumstances. Same thing with divorce. God can equally hate divorce and also recognize that Israel's behavior, their chasing after other gods, which he refers to as adultery. He says that he was a husband to them, and then they deal treacherously with him and go chase after other lovers. They go and worship other gods. And therefore, the covenant is broken between them and their husband in that they have committed this adulterous act, and therefore, divorce is appropriate. Now, of course, there's an entirely longer story to God's relationship with Israel. The book of Hosea certainly tells us that God intends, by his grace, to someday reestablish and regather Israel. But, for the moment, let's agree that the God who hates divorce also engaged in it because it was appropriate. So, we're going to look at a few passages from the Bible. We're going to talk about divorce and the God who hates it. So, if you want to stick around, that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. And I hope that it is educational. Let me say at the outset that I am a big believer in the biblical description of marriage. One man, one woman for life. That's the way it's been ever since Adam and Eve. And that is the ideal and the direction and instruction for what marriage is supposed to be. And yet, sometimes, divorce is appropriate. So I guess the best place to start is at the start. What defines biblical marriage? What constitutes biblical marriage? It wasn't a piece of paper given to them by the state. It wasn't first century arrangements between fathers to give certain virginal daughters to certain men in exchange for dowries. It wasn't the man going and building a house for he and his wife to live in. And it wasn't the coming for the bride and the joining of her bridesmaids with her when she went with her husband. It wasn't the marriage feast when family and friends would gather to celebrate the impending marriage of the two. What constituted the actual marriage was joining together in the sex act. They became one flesh. And they exclusively, the two of them and only the two of them, became one flesh. And no one was to drive that apart. Now, if one or the other of them was to become one flesh with someone outside of that exclusive marriage covenant, that undermined that marriage covenant. And in fact, when Jesus was questioned by the Pharisees about marriage and about whether a man could divorce his wife for every cause, he included something that we refer to as the exception clause. That exception is adultery, because adultery does indeed end a marriage covenant. The two are no longer exclusively one flesh. And that also helps us understand why God uses that adultery language when explaining why he put Israel away. So, marriage is one man, one woman, becoming one flesh with each other and remaining that way until they are parted by death. In the Old Testament, if a person was caught in adultery, they could be stoned to death. So not only was the marriage covenant ended by the adultery itself, but it was ended by the death of the adulterous person. All I'm getting at is that adultery does end a marriage. Now, is there room for forgiveness in such circumstances? Can grace prevail? Sure, and sometimes it does. And sometimes it doesn't. What we have to be clear about is the person who is left by an adulterous partner is not under any condemnation from God. All too often, though, they are left under condemnation by the church. So let's look at some passages that talk about divorce and see if we can make sense of it all. In Deuteronomy 21, right in the Deuteronomical law, there are rules about divorce and remarriage. In this particular context, God is instructing what happens to a woman if she has been divorced by multiple husbands. But you'll notice that once she is divorced by her first husband, she is allowed to go and marry a second husband. Here's what it actually says. If a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency, some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she goes out of his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled or made unclean. For that is an abomination, toyavah, before Yahweh. And you shall not bring sin on the land which Yahweh your God gives you as an inheritance. And that rule, allowing men to put a certificate of divorce into his wife's hand and then send her out of the house, that is the rule that was debated within first century Judaism, and it is why they came to Jesus and asked him whether or not a man could divorce his wife for any cause. And there were two different schools of thought on that. One was more marriage continuist, and one that said, yes, you can divorce her for any reason. I actually preached on this at some length on a Sunday morning at GCA, and I will post a link below if you want to know that historic argument. But for the moment, they were trying to catch Jesus, and they were trying to find out which school of thought he would subscribe to. And they wanted to know if a man could divorce his wife for any cause. And that's what leads to this answer, which includes what I referred to earlier as the exception clause. This is Matthew 19, starting at verse 3. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him, and saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And he said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it has not been that way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery." The Greek word that is translated as sexual immorality is the word porneia, from which we get the common phrase porn or pornography. But it means essentially harlotry. It means fornication, sex outside of marriage, and it includes adultery. A moment ago, we established that adultery breaks the marriage covenant. It breaks the one-fleshness that lays at the very heart and core of biblical marriage. And that is why Jesus included it here as the exception. When they said, "Can we divorce our wives for every cause?" his answer was no. In fact, if you divorce her and then go marry someone else, you are the one committing adultery against her. However, if there is porneia, uncleanness, fornication, prostitution, any kind of adulterous activity found in her, well, then that is the exception that is the allowance for divorce according to Jesus. And based on that same notion of adultery breaking a marriage covenant in advance, that marriage covenant already being broken by her uncleanness is the allowance for a husband to put her away. So if adultery breaks the marriage covenant, you can see why God, dealing with Israel and seeing them chase after other gods and worshiping other gods, would find that most intimate of relationships in order to explain how it is that Israel had essentially cheated on him, had gone and played the harlot, he says, had even sold themselves to no great advantage, had just given themselves away, and as a consequence, he appropriately divorced Israel for all that they had done. Here's what the Bible says about that. Isaiah 50, verse 1 says, "Thus says Yahweh, where is the certificate of divorce by which I have sent your mother away? Or to which of my creditors did I sell you? Behold, you were sold for your iniquities, and for your transgressions your mother was sent away." I know some people among the marriage continuous crowd who argue that that passage from Isaiah does not say that God divorced Israel. Rather, it says, "Where is the bill of your mother's divorcement? And to which of my creditors did I sell you?" But then he does say, "I sold you because of your iniquities." And that was the reason that he put her away or send her away, which is divorcement language. Nevertheless, Jeremiah is much more precise in the language. So let's take a look at that. In Jeremiah 3, starting at verse 6, "Then Yahweh said to me in the days of Josiah the king, have you seen what faithless Israel did? She went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and she was a harlot there. I said, after she has done these things, she will return to me. But she did not return, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a certificate of divorce. And yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she went and was a harlot also. So it was because of the lightness of her harlotry that she polluted the land and committed adultery with stones and trees. And yet, in spite of all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but rather in lying, declares Yahweh." All I'm trying to demonstrate here is the consistency of this notion. Whether we're talking about God with Israel, whether we're talking about Jews and their wives, in a moment we're going to look at what Paul had to say to the church, including the Gentile church, about divorce. Consistently, the exception and the allowance for divorce was as a result of adultery. And so divorce, sometimes, biblically speaking, was completely appropriate because of the behavior of one or the other partner in breaking that marriage covenant. So the God who hates divorce also divorced Israel because it was appropriate. Now we've heard a bit from God and we've heard a bit from Jesus himself. But then there is the Apostle Paul, who wrote instruction to the church of Jews and Gentiles, about their behavior, about their structure, about how they should be different than the rest of the world. And there was a situation that was developing, particularly in Corinth, where as people were coming to faith in Christ, their partners, their husbands or wives, were placed in jeopardy alongside them, and they were becoming fearful, and so some husbands and wives up and left. And I guess that's kind of understandable. If the husband or the wife came to faith in Christ, that could get you in all kinds of trouble with the local governing authorities. The time of Christian persecution would arise, and so husbands or wives would leave rather than be tortured for something that they didn't even believe in. So then what is Paul going to say? In such instances, marriages are being broken up, and it's not necessarily for adultery. It's because of belief in Christ and differences of belief. So how does he address it? Well, he writes to the Corinthian church and he says this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting at verse 12, Paul offers his own educated opinion of what should happen under these kinds of circumstances. And he writes, "But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, then he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not enslaved in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? That is the Legacy Standard Version rendering of that passage. In the King James, Paul says that a husband or wife who is left by an unbelieving spouse is under no further bondage. And what bonds could he be talking about? Well, I am convinced that he's talking about the bonds of marriage. They are no longer under that bond. And importantly, and I think this is vitally important to this whole conversation, that in the end, Paul reminds the church at Corinth that we are called to peace. There is to be peace within the church. So obviously, some amount of controversy had broken out there in Corinth where these people were being left by unbelieving spouses. Now, Paul's very clear to say, if you have come to faith in Christ and your spouse does not share that belief, that you are not to put them away. You are not to divorce them. You are to live with them for the good of the family, for the good of your children. However, if because of your faith in Christ, they up and leave, well then, Paul says, you are under no other slavery, no other bondage. You are free of that bond of that marriage. The bond has been broken. And we are called to peace. We're not to castigate a person who has been left in such a situation. And if I may offer an opinion, since Paul also offered an opinion, it is my opinion that far too often within the church, they are the first ones to pounce on people who have gone through unfortunate divorces, where they have been left by unbelieving spouses, or where a spouse has committed adultery on them and then they've gone through the divorce process. It's a painful, ugly, hurtful process, and then I think too often the church adds to the pain and the hurt and the ugliness of it. So Paul is quick to say, we, the church, are called to peace. We should come alongside such brethren and at least attempt to understand the circumstances. Because again, there are circumstances in the Bible where divorce is not only allowable, but appropriate.